My brother laughed when I fed a homeless man. He had no idea that man would destroy his life. I was always the odd one out. Growing up in a family where business was practically a religion, I was the heretic who dared to choose his own path. My mom, Linda, and my brother, Ryan, lived and breathed the family company, a legacy my dad built from scratch. Me, I had other dreams. I wanted to build something of my own, and I did. I have my own business, successful in its own right, though you'd never know it if you asked my family. To them, I was just a disappointment who turned his back on the real work. The perfect illustration of that dynamic came last night at dinner. We were gathered at an upscale steakhouse downtown, the kind of place where the valet wears white gloves and the water costs more than a burger anywhere else. It reminded me of those family dinners at Outback Steakhouse when I was a kid, Mom always insisting on sharing a bloomin' onion while Dad cracked jokes about corporate bigwigs. The occasion? Celebrating Ryan's latest business success. He'd landed some big contract, which, of course, was a monumental family event. I got the invite last minute, probably out of obligation, rather than genuine desire. As we sat at the table, the conversation was the usual. Ryan's success, his strategic mind, and his uncanny ability to walk on corporate water. Mom, of course, hung on his every word, occasionally glancing at me with that familiar look of thinly veiled disappointment. Jessica, Ryan's wife, chimed in now and then with her perfectly rehearsed praise, while their daughter, Lily, played with her napkin and stared at her plate. I kept quiet, sipping my drink and hoping the evening would end sooner rather than later. Halfway through the meal, I glanced out the window and noticed a man sitting on the sidewalk. He was hunched over, bundled in layers of ragged clothing despite the mild evening. His beard was thick and gray, his face partially hidden by grime. But there was something about him, something that stirred an old memory I couldn't pinpoint, that made my stomach clench. I couldn't place it, but the resemblance to someone from my past tugged at me. I caught the waiter's attention and ordered a hot meal to be delivered to the man outside. As the waiter jotted down the order, he gave me a quick nod and a good on you, man. The kind of small gesture that feels normal in a place where tipping is king. When Ryan noticed, he let out a loud, mocking laugh. "Well, look at that," he said, voice carrying across the restaurant. "Ethan's finally found his target demographic, street people. Guess even the homeless have more ambition than you, huh?" The table erupted in laughter. Even Mom smiled, covering her mouth with her napkin as though that made it more polite. Jessica didn't bother hiding her amusement, while Ryan smirked like he'd just delivered a late-night comedy special. Only Lily sat there, her eyes meeting mine across the table with a sadness that cut deeper than their laughter. I didn't respond. What was the point? I've been down this road too many times. But as the waiter placed a steaming plate of food in a to-go bag and walked outside to the stranger, I made a decision. Not again. Not another night of silent endurance. No more smiling through the insults. No more tolerating their disdain just because we share DNA. As I signed the check, adding a generous tip that made the waiter smile, I thought about the man outside and that nagging familiarity. I didn't know it yet, but that man on the sidewalk was more than a familiar face. He was the first crack in the perfect facade of our family. And I was done pretending everything was fine. The decision to stop playing along with my family's charade hit me like a ton of bricks. Classic enough is enough moment. It sat with me like an itch I couldn't ignore. It was like waiting for the other shoe to drop. Classic American anxiety in action. The next morning, I woke up early, brewed a cup of coffee strong enough to wake the dead, and sat down at my desk. I opened my laptop and logged into the shared family business portal. Owning a stake in the company gave me access to the financials, though I'd rarely cared enough to dig into them. Until now, scrolling through spreadsheets of earnings and expenditures, I quickly realized I was out of my depth. Numbers blurred together. Rows and columns danced mockingly across the screen. Dad had always said, "Follow the money when something feels off," but I needed help. That's when I remembered Margaret. She was Dad's old friend and our family's go-to financial consultant, who once helped us balance the books after a chaotic Thanksgiving, when everyone was more interested in pie than profits. If anyone could make sense of these numbers, it was her. By lunchtime, I was sitting across from Margaret in a booth at Mel's Diner, the kind of place with sticky menus, neon signs buzzing softly, and bottomless coffee refills. The waitress, a woman named Carol with big hair and an attitude to match, dropped off our plates with a casual, "Y'all enjoy now." Margaret looked older, with more gray than I remembered, but her eyes were just as sharp. She flipped through the printed statements I'd brought, her lips tightening as she scanned the pages. "These transactions," she said, tapping a finger on a column of transfers. "They're going to shell companies, like empty storefronts with no real business. Look, recurring payments to LLCs with no legitimate activity. Shell companies?" My stomach nodded. Why would the family business be paying fake firms? "That's the question," she said, pushing the papers toward me. "Someone's funneling money out, and it's been happening for a while." I rubbed my temples, trying to piece it together, and then an image flashed through my mind. The homeless man outside the restaurant. That familiar face buried beneath a beard and layers of grime. "Wait," I said, pulling out my phone. "I took a picture of a guy last night. He looked familiar. Can you tell me if you recognize him?" I opened the photo I'd snapped from the restaurant window, a blurry shot of the man just before the waiter handed him the meal. Margaret took the phone and squinted at the screen. Her eyes widened. "That's George," she whispered. "George Mitchell. He was your dad's business partner. Remember how he always joked that the best investment strategy was buy low, pray hard?" I froze. George had been Dad's right-hand man for years. I remember how he helped us fix the office wiring one Thanksgiving weekend when no electrician would come out, just because he said family comes first. I remembered him from childhood. He always brought me Reese's cups when he came by the house. But I hadn't heard his name in over a decade. "What happened to him?" I asked. Margaret's jaw tightened. "He was fired shortly after your dad passed away, accused of embezzlement. But I never believed it. The reports were shaky at best. And you know your dad trusted George with his life." The pieces clicked together in my mind. The bogus shell companies. The man outside the restaurant. The humiliation Ryan had hurled at me just as I'd sent a meal to someone who was once part of our family's inner circle. "Who fired him?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Ryan," Margaret said, her voice low. I stared at the photo on my phone, my pulse racing. My brother had destroyed a man's life, possibly to cover his own tracks. And now that man was living on the streets. I needed to find George. And just my luck. Nothing like chasing ghosts when the family skeletons are rattling louder than a cheap carnival ride. But first, I had to figure out just how deep this deception went. Finding George wasn't easy. It was like finding a needle in a haystack. I spent the better part of the weekend driving around town, checking every park, shelter, and makeshift camp I could think of. I asked around, showed his picture to people who gave me skeptical glances, but eventually shared what they knew. It was like trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing. Late Sunday afternoon, I finally found him sitting on a bench near Riverside Park, clutching a stained coffee cup like it was the last thing tethering him to this world. His eyes were sunken, his clothes worn thin from months, maybe years, of rough nights under open skies. For a moment, I hesitated. What was I even going to say? But then I remembered that mocking laugh from Ryan and the empty shell companies Margaret had pointed out. I approached him with a warm cup of coffee and a fresh bagel from the nearby cart. He looked at me warily until recognition flickered in his eyes. "Ethan?" His voice was rough, like sandpaper rubbed across old wood. We sat there, the sounds of joggers, dog walkers, kids yelling in the distance, and the jingle of the ice cream truck filling the air. Slowly, piece by piece, George told me his story. After Dad passed away, things at the company shifted. Ryan stepped in like he'd been waiting for the chance. like a kid finally getting the keys to the candy store. George noticed discrepancies almost immediately, money moving through accounts that didn't add up. When he brought it up, Ryan dismissed it as new strategies. When George pushed harder, he was hit with accusations of embezzlement, fake audits, falsified documents. George was fired, his reputation destroyed. He tried to fight it, but who was going to believe the disgraced accountant over the golden boy of the family business? His wife left soon after, taking what little savings they had and moving to Florida with the dog, like a scene straight out of a bad sitcom. The house followed when he couldn't find steady work. The man who once sat at our kitchen table, trading jokes with my dad over cold beers, had been reduced to this. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. This wasn't just corporate greed or some internal squabble. Ryan had systematically crushed a man to cover his tracks. And if he'd done this to George, how many others had been caught in the crossfire? "George," I said, staring at the cup cradled in his hands, "we need to prove it. We need evidence." He gave a bitter chuckle. "Yeah, good luck with that," he said. Ryan made sure everything was airtight. "Not everything," I said. "Margaret and I found the shell companies. We just need to connect the dots." For the first time, his eyes lit with something resembling hope. "There were payments," he said, leaning forward. "Strange ones. They started showing up right after your dad died. Large sums moving through dummy accounts." My pulse quickened. If we could trace those payments, we might find the smoking gun. Ryan hadn't just taken over the company. He'd taken the wheel like a corporate shark circling a sinking ship. And now, we were going to prove it. The next morning, I picked up George from the park, bright and early, with coffee in hand. The cold morning air made the coffee steam curl like a ribbon, making each sip feel even more comforting. He was sitting on the same bench, cradling that battered coffee cup like a fragile relic. His eyes, hollow and tired, tracked me as I approached with a paper bag and a large coffee from the corner deli. "Come on," I said, handing him the bag. "Breakfast on the go?" He hesitated before taking it, his fingers brushing against mine for a second, a touch that felt like sandpaper against smooth skin. We walked to the car in silence, the weight of the previous day still lingering between us. As I navigated through the morning traffic, I stole glances his way. His shoulders sagged like a man carrying a lifetime of regret. "Where are we going?" he asked finally. "You'll see." I pulled into the parking lot of an old brick apartment complex on the edge of town. Nothing fancy, just a clean, safe place with a faded welcome mat out front and a few kids playing with a basketball in the parking lot. We climbed the stairs to the second floor, the air filled with the scent of someone cooking bacon down the hall, the distant hum of a TV game show, and the faint creak of old floorboards under our feet. I unlocked the door. Inside was a modest one-bedroom with mismatched furniture I'd picked up the night before, a stock fridge, and fresh sheets on the bed. The air smelled faintly of lemon cleaner, the kind that instantly brings back memories of Saturday morning chores and spring cleaning. George stood in the doorway, unmoving. Seeing him like this hit me hard. This was a man who once strode through our office halls with confidence, a steady presence you could count on. Now, he looked like someone bracing for disappointment, afraid to hope again. "This is yours," I said, "for as long as you need. I'll cover the costs until you get back on your feet." His breath caught, and his chest heaved as he gripped the doorframe. His eyes glistened, and then the dam broke. The man who once sat in a polished office across from my father now sobbed like a lost child. His knees gave out, and he sank to the floor. I knelt beside him, resting a hand on his shoulder. "You didn't have to do this," he choked out between sobs. "Yeah, well," I said, forcing a smile, "family looks out for each other. At least, that's what Dad taught us." We sat there for a long time, the only sounds his labored breathing and the muffled bounce of the basketball outside. Finally, he wiped his eyes with the back of his sleeve and looked at me with a resolve I hadn't seen before. "Let's get that guy," he said. We spent the rest of the day at my apartment with Margaret, hunched over laptops and stacks of papers. George guided us through the labyrinth of shell companies. Margaret's eyes sharpened as she spotted patterns. Repeated sums deposited into accounts tied to offshore entities. These withdrawals, she said, tapping the screen, they're all coming from the same source. The company's pension fund. My heart sank. The pension fund was sacred. Money set aside as a promise to employees, especially in blue-collar communities, who counted on it for their retirement. In the U.S., these funds symbolize stability and security for working families who trust the system to take care of them later in life. Ryan's been siphoning cash from retirees, George said, voice trembling with rage. No wonder he was so eager to push me out. We traced the transactions through layers of fake entities, each step confirming what we feared. Millions had been funneled out since my father's death. We need to act, Margaret said. We have enough for a board meeting. Yeah, I said, exhaling slowly. Let's give them a show they won't forget. We set the plan in motion, contacting the board members under the guise of an urgent financial review. Probably the only meeting they'd attend that didn't involve bad coffee, endless speeches, or rescheduling around their golf games and business trips. I watched George from across the room as he jotted down names on a legal pad. He looked different now. Less like a ghost, more like a man reclaiming his life. We were ready. And Ryan? He had no idea what was coming. The boardroom smelled like stale coffee and polished wood, a familiar scent of corporate formality, like every other boardroom in America where the coffee's bad and the stakes feel bigger than they are. Ryan stood at the head of the mahogany table, adjusting his cufflinks like a game show host about to unveil the grand prize, gesturing toward a sleek PowerPoint presentation projected on the wall. His voice was smooth, confident, like a late-night infomercial host pitching a product nobody really needed, like that avocado slicer everyone buys and never uses. Our profits have grown by 18% this quarter, he announced, his grin stretching wider than seemed natural. Thanks to our innovative strategies, the company's future is brighter than ever. The room responded with nods and polite smiles. I sat near the back, gripping a leather folder stuffed with documents. My heart raced, but I forced myself to stay calm. Margaret sat beside me, her expression neutral, while George waited outside the door, ready for his cue. Ryan clicked to the next slide, a chart with an upward trend line. This success reflects our team's dedication and strategic investments, he continued, pausing for effect. Now, let's discuss next steps. Actually, I said, standing up, let's discuss the real numbers. Heads turned. Ryan's smile faltered. Ethan, he said through clenched teeth, this isn't the time. It absolutely is, I said, walking toward the table. I opened the folder and handed a thick stack of papers to the nearest board member. What you're looking at are transaction records. Payments funneled through offshore accounts linked to shell companies, fake entities with no legitimate business activity. Murmurs filled the room. I passed more documents around, letting the weight of the evidence settle in. These payments, I continued, came from the company's pension fund. Money meant for retired employees who gave their lives to this business. Ryan's face turned a shade paler. This is ridiculous, he snapped. These accusations are baseless. Really? I gestured toward the door. Let's hear from someone who knows firsthand. The door opened and George walked in. The room went still. Gone was the disheveled man I'd found on that park bench. His hair was neatly combed, his beard shaved, and he wore a tailored navy blue suit that fit like it had been made for him. The scuffed sneakers had been replaced by polished leather shoes. Ryan's jaw dropped. George? Surprise? George said, his voice steady. You shouldn't be. George walked to the center of the room. I was your father's partner for 15 years, he said, addressing the board. After his death, Ryan accused me of embezzlement and fired me. But the truth is, I discovered the discrepancies you see in those documents. When I tried to stop it, he set me up and ruined my reputation. Gasps echoed across the table. Margaret clicked a remote, and a new slide appeared. A web of transactions connecting company accounts to luxury purchases. "Here's where the money went," I said, stepping beside George. "A yacht named Sea Whisperer, registered in the Bahamas, a beachfront property, and other personal expenses, all paid for with pension funds." Jessica, Ryan's wife, leaned forward, her perfectly manicured nails tapping the table, as if hoping the truth might change if she waited long enough. "Wait," she said, eyes wide. "A yacht?" "Yes," Margaret said. "Registered 2 months after your anniversary." Jessica's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. "You've got to be kidding me." Ryan's eyes darted to the exit, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed hard and shifted on his feet, like a kid caught sneaking out past curfew. He lunged for the door, but George was faster, stepping in his path. "Not this time," Ryan George said. I reached for my phone. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, holding it up, "this evidence is being sent to the authorities as we speak. The police will arrive shortly." Ryan's face crumbled. The board members sat in stunned silence. Jessica crossed her arms and glared at her husband. "A yacht?" she repeated incredulously. The door buzzed, signaling the arrival of the police. "Game over, Big Brother," I said. In that moment, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. Relief that justice was finally being served, sadness that it had come to this with my own family. And that was just the beginning. The police officers stepped into the boardroom, exchanging wary glances as their radios crackled with that distinct background hum, like a soundtrack from an old cop show. Their radios crackling softly in the tense silence. Ryan froze mid-step, like a kid caught sneaking a cookie from the jar, his eyes flicking from the officers to the door like a cornered raccoon weighing its escape options. The lead officer, a stout man with a mustache that belonged in an 80s cop movie, exchanged a glance with his partner, then held up a hand. "Ryan Thompson," he asked, voice calm but firm. Ryan's shoulders stiffened. "This is a misunderstanding," he said, mustering a weak smile. "I'm the chief executive officer of this company." "Yeah," the officer said, pulling out a folded sheet of paper. "And this is a warrant for your arrest." The color drained from Ryan's face as handcuffs clicked around his wrists. Across the room, Jessica stood with her arms crossed, glaring at him like he was a broken appliance she'd been meaning to toss for months. "A yacht," she muttered under her breath, shaking her head. "All those late nights." The officers led Ryan away, and the door thudded shut behind them. Silence hung in the air until one of the board members, an older man with thick glasses, cleared his throat. "So," he said, adjusting his tie. "What now?" "Now," I said, stepping to the front of the room, "we clean up this mess." The next week was a blur of meetings, phone calls, and damage control. Margaret and I pored over financial records, working through endless evenings, tracing the stolen money. George worked with HR to reassure nervous employees. Jessica, to my surprise, showed up one afternoon with a binder full of documents. "Found these in Ryan's home office," she said, dropping it on my desk. He thought he was clever, hiding it under old tax returns. Inside were records of additional offshore accounts, payments to luxury vendors, and bizarrely, a receipt for a hot tub installation with the memo for stress relief. "Looks like Ryan spared no expense," I said, flipping through the pages. "Yeah," Jessica said, sinking into a chair. "And I thought he was working late all those nights." By the end of the week, we had compiled a comprehensive report for the board. The numbers were staggering. Millions siphoned from hard-working employees who trusted the company. The board voted unanimously to appoint me as interim CEO. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent my whole life avoiding this job, and now here I was, sitting in an office with a view of the parking lot. It felt surreal. I never wanted this job, but now I couldn't walk away from it. At the first staff meeting, I stood at the head of the room where Dad once gave his speeches. "I know the past year has been rough," I said, scanning the room. "We've lost trust, but We're going to fix that. Starting today, every dollar goes where it belongs. The employees applauded, though a few still eyed me with skepticism. I got it. Trust doesn't come back after one speech. After the meeting, George clapped a hand on my shoulder. Your dad would be proud, he said. I hope so, I said. That evening, I drove to Mom's house. Linda Thompson greeted me with a tight smile and led me to the back porch. Quite a week, she said, pouring iced tea into plastic cups. I saw the news. Yeah, I said. Ryan really went all in. She stirred her tea with a straw. Your father always said money tests people. Some pass. Some don't. We sat in silence, the ice clinking in our cups. Finally, she reached out and squeezed my hand. I'm proud of you, Ethan. It was the first time she'd ever said those words. Our conversation was interrupted by a ringtone. I checked my phone. Ryan, calling from jail with that distinct prison-call tone that always sounds like a scene from a movie. I put the phone on speaker. Mom, Ryan's voice crackled through the speaker. Don't listen to Ethan. He's lying. I did it all to save the business. I had to. Linda's face went pale. Ryan, what have you done? I did it for us, he pleaded. For Dad's legacy. Tears welled in her eyes. No, she whispered. You did it for yourself. Ryan's voice grew desperate. Mom, please. If you just talk to the lawyers, they can fix this. The robotic voice in the background intoned. This call is from a correctional facility. Linda straightened her shoulders, her face hardening. No, Ryan, she said. You did this. You broke our trust. Mom, please. I was saving the business. You were stealing from the people who built this company, she said, voice trembling but firm. And you did it for yachts and hot tubs. Ryan's voice cracked, thick with desperation, like a drowning man grasping at the last floating branch. I did it for the family. For Dad. Linda ended the call and set the phone down, her hand lingering on the device as if hoping it might undo what she'd just heard. He's lost, she said softly. The days after Ryan's arrest were a whirlwind of decisions, paperwork, and quiet moments of disbelief. It felt like running a marathon in flip-flops, exhausting, awkward, and never-ending. I never imagined I'd be the one steering the family business through a crisis like this. Dad's old leather chair in the CEO's office still squeaked the same way when I leaned back, but the weight of it now pressed harder than ever. George sat across from me, thumbing through a binder. The pension fund disbursements are ready, he said. We can start restoring payments by next week. Let's do it, I said. These people deserve to see that the company hasn't forgotten them. By Friday, checks went out to every retired employee who'd been shortchanged. We held a small event in the company cafeteria to announce the pension restoration. The retirees arrived cautiously, some with walkers, others with skeptical eyes. The cafeteria smelled like burnt coffee and day-old donuts, with plastic chairs that wobbled if you leaned too far. When George stepped up to the microphone and explained the process, their skepticism softened into gratitude. One woman with silver hair and a Patriot sweatshirt wiped her eyes. Never thought I'd see that money again, she said. I was already choosing between meds and groceries. That night, Margaret sent me a picture of George sitting on a folding chair while an elderly man shook his hand. Behind him, a handmade sign read, Pension Restoration Fund, Keeping Promises. At home, I found Lily sitting cross-legged on the living room rug. She often spent weekends with me and my fiancé, especially when Jessica needed a break or just some quiet time. Crayons scattered around her. She was working intently on a drawing. What are you making? I asked. She held up a picture of a man handing a sandwich through a window to a ragged figure. It's called The Man Who Shared His Sandwich, she said. Like Uncle Ethan. The next morning, the news hit. Ryan had been released on bail. A grainy photo showed him stepping out of the courthouse beside a tall woman in oversized sunglasses. No name, no background, just an unidentified acquaintance. Jessica filed for divorce that afternoon. He had a second phone. She told me over the phone. There were texts and wire transfers. I was married to a stranger. I mean, sure, I knew he loved himself more than the rest of us, but a whole secret life? That's next level. Mom sat on the porch later, cradling a glass of iced tea that sweated in the late afternoon sun. All those years, she said softly, I kept telling myself Ryan was strong like his father. Turns out he was just clever. The next day, an email pinged on my laptop. Subject, for Dad. It was from Lily. Dad, I love you, it read. But I can't say what you did was okay. I miss you because you're my dad. But I know Uncle Ethan is doing the right thing, even if it means you can't come home. She came into the room as I finished reading it. She fidgeted with the hem of her sweatshirt, her eyes serious. I sent it to him, she said, voice tight with nervousness. I hope he knows I still love him. I hugged her. He knows, I said, though I wasn't sure it was true. And just as I thought we'd reached the end of the chaos, Margaret called. Ethan, she said, we traced one of the offshore accounts. The name on it, Margaret Steele, the woman with Ryan at the courthouse. Exactly. The game, it seemed, was far from over. Or, as Dad used to say, just when you think the circus is leaving town, another clown steps out of the car. The restaurant hadn't changed much since that night. Same dim lighting, same overpriced steaks, and the same sense of manufactured exclusivity, where the water costs as much as a burger anywhere else. George and I sat in a corner booth, the scent of sizzling ribeye and garlic butter thick in the air. The last time I was here, I'd left with humiliation burning in my chest. Tonight, I felt something different, closure. Can't believe you picked this place, George said, raising an eyebrow as he cut into his steak. Didn't think you want to come back. That's exactly why I did, I said. Sometimes you have to walk through the fire to make sure it doesn't scare you anymore. He nodded, chewing thoughtfully. Well, the steak's decent, I'll give you that. Outside the window, the city bustled with its usual Friday night energy. Cars honked, pedestrians wove through crosswalks, and a food truck on the corner blasted Sweet Caroline, with a handful of strangers swaying along to the chorus. I was about to comment on the impromptu karaoke session when something caught George's attention. Is that? He set down his fork and squinted toward the window. Isn't that Greg Thompson? I followed his gaze. Across the street, a man in a faded polo shirt and sagging khakis stood beside a taco cart, handing out napkins and taking orders. His once pristine golf swing had been replaced by robotic movements. His eyes, once sharp with corporate arrogance, now scanned the crowd with wary resignation. Yep, I said. Ryan's old golf buddy. George let out a low whistle. He used to brag about his lake house. What happened? Turns out, I said, taking a sip of my drink, just like a bad poker player, he showed all his cards. He was in on the pension fund scam. When Ryan went down, so did his network of enablers. The IRS seized the lake house, the cars, the golf club membership, and now he's selling tacos, George said, shaking his head. Life comes at you fast. The conversation drifted back to the business. 6 months had passed since Ryan's arrest, and the company was finally stabilizing. The pension fund had been fully restored, and we'd even launched a community outreach program to support retirees beyond the money they'd lost. Got a letter from Ed Thompson last week. George said he was finally able to buy his grandson that drum set he's been promising for years. Yeah, I said, laughing softly. And I heard from Marjorie Davis. She said her bridge club now calls her High Roller Marge since she took everyone out for steak dinners with her back pay. The waitress arrived with a check and a knowing grin. The kind of grin people get when they recognize you from the news but pretend not to care. "You're the guys from that pension story on Channel 5, right?" she asked. George laughed. "Guilty." "Well," she said, placing the bill on the table, "my dad worked for your company for 30 years. He was one of the folks who got his pension back." "Thank you." As she walked away, George shook his head. "Never thought we'd get here." "Me neither," I said. "But when you help others, you end up getting a lot more than you give." Outside, Greg Thompson wiped his hands on his apron and leaned against the taco cart, staring through the window at us. His jaw tightened, his eyes glimmering with what looked like a mix of embarrassment and bitterness. Our eyes met for a second, and then he looked away, shifting his gaze to the ground. "Come on," I said, tossing some cash on the table. "Let's leave a big tip and call it a night." We stepped out into the cool night air. The city hummed with life around us, but the noise felt different this time, less chaotic, more like the rhythm of a life finally moving in the right direction.